The courthouse that morning looked more like a fortress under siege than a civic building where justice was supposed to be calm and measured. Television vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes tilted toward the sky. Reporters milled about with coffee cups in one hand and microphones in the other, rehearsing their opening lines as if preparing for a performance on a grand stage. Uniformed officers stood shoulder to shoulder near the courthouse steps, trying to keep the crowd at bay. Everyone wanted to see the faces tied to the case that had transfixed the nation. Inside, the tension was even thicker. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of journalists, family members, and curious onlookers who had secured coveted seats. The air smelled faintly of old varnish, and too many people breathing the same nervous breath. The hum of whispered conversations filled the chamber until the bailiff barked for order, cutting the noise to silence. At the center of the storm sat the accused, a man in his late 30s with close-cropped hair and an expression so tightly controlled it seemed carved in stone. He wore a simple gray suit, nothing flashy, but there was something unsettling in the way he sat. Back straight, eyes forward, hands clasped together. He had been a police officer once, a detail that both complicated the case and fueled public outrage. A man sworn to uphold the law now stood accused of betraying it in the most violent way imaginable. The charges were heavy. The prosecution claimed he had orchestrated a crime that had left 2 innocent parents dead and their only child alive by sheer accident, or perhaps fate. It was a case that combined tragedy, betrayal, and mystery, the kind of story that splashed across front pages and sent television ratings soaring. People wanted to know, was this man a monster hiding behind a badge, or a scapegoat in a system desperate for answers? The judge, an older man with deep lines etched into his forehead, presided with an air of weary patience. He had seen high-profile cases before, but something about this trial felt different. Maybe it was the involvement of a child so young, or maybe it was the way the courtroom seemed to pulse with anticipation, like everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. He tapped his gavel gently, not to silence anyone but to steady himself. The prosecution's table was stacked with binders, photographs, and evidence bags, each labeled meticulously. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, shuffled through her notes with the precision of someone who knew that one misplaced detail could collapse the entire case. She was known for her unshakable composure, yet even she felt the weight of what lay ahead. The defense, meanwhile, seemed almost smug. Their lead attorney was a tall man with a booming voice and a reputation for dismantling prosecutions piece by piece. He thrived on the theater of the courtroom and today promised a full house. He leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his client that made the man's lips twitch in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Everyone knew the case hinged on evidence that was circumstantial at best. There were no clear fingerprints, no camera footage tying the accused directly to the crime. What prosecutors had instead were fragments, timelines that didn't add up, a trail of inconsistencies, and the haunting testimony of a single survivor, the 3-year-old girl. The very idea of putting her on the stand had stirred controversy. Was it ethical to expose a child so young to the weight of a courtroom? Could her words even be trusted? Defense lawyers scoffed at the idea, calling it a desperate ploy. Yet the prosecution insisted her presence was vital. She had seen something. Maybe she couldn't articulate it in long sentences, but sometimes truth didn't need many words. The public clung to that notion. The media painted her as both victim and beacon of hope, a symbol of innocence forced into the harsh glare of justice. Headlines spoke of the tiny witness and the child with the key. It was sensational, yes, but it was also unbearably tragic. A toddler robbed of her parents now stood at the center of a case too complex for most adults to fathom. As the trial opened, the first days were consumed with procedure, motions filed, objections raised, technicalities argued over like chess moves. The jury sat quietly, absorbing it all, though their faces betrayed fatigue. Legal battles often dulled into monotony, but this case carried an undercurrent that kept everyone alert. the promise that eventually the child would appear. That promise hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Each witness called before her seemed to be paving the way, laying down context, building tension. Detectives recounted their investigation step by step. Neighbors about noises they had heard that night. Experts dissected phone records and forensic reports. Yet with every passing day, the audience grew restless. They weren't here for numbers or technical jargon. They were waiting for the moment. The moment when a 3-year-old girl would walk into the room and remind them all why they cared in the first place. On the morning it was announced she would testify, the courthouse overflowed. Security tightened. Reporters nearly trampled one another for front-row seats, and the families of both victim and accused clutched each other as if bracing for impact. Even seasoned journalists admitted they felt uneasy. It was one thing to watch lawyers spar over evidence. It was another to watch a child climb into a witness chair, her innocence thrust into the spotlight. The judge addressed the courtroom before proceedings began. His tone was stern, but beneath it was something almost paternal. "You will remember," he said, "that a child is not a spectacle. She is not here for your entertainment. She is here because justice demands her voice, however small it may be." Despite his words, the air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone leaned forward, hearts pounding, as the bailiff stepped toward the side door. In a moment, it would open and the girl would appear. No one knew what she would say or if she would say anything at all. But they all knew this. Whatever happened next would decide the fate of the trial, and perhaps the fate of the man sitting so still at the defense table. The accused shifted slightly, his jaw tightening as though bracing for a blow. The prosecutor flipped to a fresh page in her notes, though she doubted she'd need them. The defense attorney straightened his tie, preparing to pounce on any weakness. The jury, 12 ordinary citizens, held their breath. And in that suspended moment, before the door even opened, the courtroom realized it was standing at the edge of something unforgettable. The side door opened slowly, almost hesitantly, and the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted in an instant. Every conversation, every whispered remark, every movement stilled. People craned their necks. Journalists leaned so far forward their pens nearly slipped from their hands. The hush was so complete that even the faint squeak of the hinges seemed. Then she appeared. A small figure, dwarfed by the cavernous courtroom, clutching the hand of her guardian as if it were a lifeline. She wore a pale yellow dress with tiny embroidered flowers, her hair tied in 2 uneven ponytails that bounced with every step. In her other arm, pressed tightly against her chest, was a stuffed rabbit whose ears were worn and bent from years of holding. The 3-year-old looked fragile, like a porcelain doll placed in the middle of a battlefield. Her eyes, wide, dark, and searching, swept across the room, taking in the towering judge, the rows of strangers, the men and women staring at her as though she were a character in a play. For a moment she seemed frozen. Then her guardian bent down and whispered something softly. She nodded, barely perceptible, and took another step forward. Even seasoned court staff felt their throats tighten. There was something devastating about seeing someone so small in a place designed for adults to argue, accuse, and defend. She should have been in a playground, not in a courtroom. She should have been chasing butterflies or painting with crayons, not preparing to relive the worst night of her short life. The judge, whose reputation was built on stern authority, softened visibly. He leaned forward, removing his glasses, and spoke in a tone far gentler than the one he usually used to scold attorneys. "Good morning," he said warmly. "Do you know why you're here today?" The child didn't answer. She pressed her face against her guardian's side, peeking out only slightly. The stuffed rabbit slipped, and she quickly adjusted it, as if the toy itself gave her courage. The prosecutor, careful not to rush the moment, approached slowly. She crouched down until she was almost eye level with the little girl, setting her notes aside. "Hi there," she said softly, her voice stripped of all courtroom sharpness. "My name is Sarah. Can you tell me your name?" A beat of silence passed. The child's lips parted, then closed again. She looked at the rabbit, then at her guardian. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she answered. The sound was so faint that the clerk asked her to repeat it. She did, a little louder this time. Her name floated into the silence, fragile yet undeniable. A murmur swept through the courtroom, relief mixed with awe. She had spoken. It was only her name, but it carried the weight of proof. She could communicate, and she was not as silent as many had feared. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. He had banked on her silence, on her freezing up under pressure. His strategy relied on the jury dismissing her testimony as unreliable or incoherent. But now, watching the way the jurors leaned forward, their expressions softening toward the child, he sensed the tide turning. Sympathy was already blooming in their hearts, and sympathy in a trial like this could be as dangerous as evidence. The prosecutor asked another simple question. Do you remember the dog that came to your house that night? The girl's head tilted slightly, her ponytail swaying. Her tiny hand stroked the rabbit's ear. She nodded. The response was so small, so understated, yet it felt monumental. Each nod, each whispered word was like a stone added to the foundation of the case. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. But the defense wasn't ready to concede. Rising to his feet, the defense attorney objected. Your Honor, he boomed, his deep voice breaking the fragile rhythm of the testimony. This is a child, 3 years old. She doesn't understand what's being asked of her. We're wasting the court's time with theatrics. Gasps rippled across the gallery. The jurors stiffened, visibly uncomfortable with his cold dismissal. The judge raised a hand for silence and fixed the defense attorney with a warning glare. Counselor, you will show respect. This child is a witness and she will be heard. If you cannot conduct yourself appropriately, I will hold you in contempt. The attorney sat down, his jaw tight, but the damage was done. His objection had only made him appear callous, while the child's presence radiated innocence. The guardian leaned down, whispering again, and this time the girl straightened slightly. She wasn't confident, but she was trying. The prosecutor continued gently, asking about small, non-threatening details, what she had seen, what she remembered who had been there. Most of her answers were nods or a single word at a time. Still, they painted a haunting picture. Then came the moment that silenced even the scratching of journalists' pens. The prosecutor, almost hesitant, asked, Do you remember a man that night? The girl froze. Her tiny fingers tightened around the rabbit's neck. Her breathing quickened. For a long moment, everyone thought she wouldn't respond. The judge shifted uneasily, ready to step in and end the questioning if the child was too distressed. But then slowly, she lifted her arm and pointed. The direction of her finger was unmistakable. Every head turned at once, eyes following the trembling hand of a 3-year-old child. She wasn't pointing at the judge, or at her guardian, or at the prosecutor. Her finger extended across the room, tiny and delicate but steady. She was pointing at the defendant. A stunned silence crashed over the courtroom. It was the kind of silence that didn't just pause the room, it froze time itself. The accused shifted in his seat, his carefully constructed composure faltering for the first time. His lips pressed together, his knuckles whitened against the edge of the defense table. The prosecutor didn't press further. She didn't need to. That single gesture, innocent and untainted, had spoken louder than paragraphs of legal argument. The defense attorney leapt to his feet again, shouting for the record that this was inadmissible, unreliable, meaningless. She doesn't know what she's doing, he cried. She's 3 years old. Children point at strangers in grocery stores. His words, meant to undermine, only made him sound desperate. The jury, however, wasn't looking at him. Their eyes remained fixed on the girl, on the way her hand stayed raised, her gaze unwavering. She didn't fully understand the storm she had unleashed, but the certainty in her small action carried a force no legal training could dismantle. Finally, the judge called for a recess. His gavel struck sharply, though his voice wavered ever so slightly as he announced it. The courtroom erupted the moment he left, reporters rushing to phones, spectators whispering furiously, lawyers regrouping like generals after a surprise attack. Through it all, the girl clung to her guardian, her rabbit pressed tight against her chest. To her, the pointing hadn't been an act of strategy or courage. It was simply truth. She had seen the man, and her heart remembered what her words could not yet express. For the jury, for the prosecution, and even for the public beyond those courthouse walls, that moment changed everything. And for the defense, it was the first crack in a wall they had thought unbreakable. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, staining the oak-paneled walls in shades of amber. Outside, reporters were already sending breaking updates, their voices carried through live broadcasts across the country. Inside, however, the atmosphere was suffocating. After the girl's silent but devastating gesture, her small finger pointing straight at the accused, the trial had entered a realm no one could have predicted. The recess had ended, but the courtroom didn't feel the same. The jurors had returned to their seats with expressions carved by unease. Some leaned forward, elbows on the rail, staring at the child as though she were the key to a lock they hadn't been able to turn. Others looked at the defendant with a new weight in their eyes, as if trying to reconcile the image of a once-respected police officer with the possibility of him being the villain behind the tragedy. The defense attorney adjusted his tie nervously. For the first time in his career, words seemed to betray him. He had planned for every argument, every shred of evidence the prosecution might present. But how did one dismantle the testimony of a child too innocent to fabricate malice? He whispered urgently to his client, who sat stiff and silent, jaw clenched. The prosecutor, on the other hand, exuded calm control. She didn't press the moment too hard. She knew jurors didn't like feeling manipulated. Instead, she let the silence breathe, let the child's simple action echo in their minds. In the courtroom, silence often screamed louder than words. The bailiff called for order, and the little girl was led back to the witness stand. She walked slowly, dragging the ear of her stuffed rabbit along the floor. Every eye followed her, but she didn't seem to notice. Her gaze wandered, caught occasionally by the gleam of polished wood or the faint shadows dancing across the floor. She was still just a child, curious, distracted, innocent. Yet the weight she carried into that room was far greater than most adults could bear. The judge leaned forward again, his voice low and careful. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "you're very brave to be here. If you get tired or if you don't want to answer, you can say so, all right." She nodded, her small chin dipping against the rabbit's head. The prosecutor crouched again, keeping her tone soft, almost conversational. "Do you remember what happened that night? You don't have to tell me everything, just what you remember." The girl's brow furrowed, the kind of expression that belonged on an adult trying to recall a long-forgotten detail, not on a toddler. She pressed the rabbit against her lips, then whispered something too faint to hear. The clerk leaned in, asking her to repeat it. This time, she spoke louder. "Bang!" The word, simple and chilling, rippled through the courtroom. Jurors stiffened. A woman in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens almost tearing the paper. The prosecutor nodded softly, not pushing, allowing the child to set her own pace. "Bang," she repeated gently. "Did you hear that sound that night?" The little girl nodded, her ponytails bobbing. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection, leading the witness." His voice boomed, but it sounded shrill in the heavy silence that followed the child's answer. The judge sighed, his patience thinning. "Overruled. The witness may continue." The prosecutor tried another angle. "After you heard that sound, what did you see?" The girl's tiny hand shook as she gripped the rabbit. Her eyes flickered toward the defendant, then darted away as though burned. She whispered again, "Man." The jurors leaned in as one. Even the stenographer, trained to remain impassive, glanced up with wide eyes. The prosecutor froze for a moment, understanding the danger of pressing too far. The girl was balancing on the fragile edge of memory and trauma. One wrong question, one push too hard, and she could crumble. So instead, the prosecutor said gently, "Thank you, you're very brave." The defense attorney jumped in quickly, eager to regain control. "Your Honor, I request permission to cross-examine." The judge hesitated. Cross-examining a 3-year-old was a dangerous game, but denying it would give the defense grounds for appeal. "Proceed," he said reluctantly, his voice carrying a warning. The defense attorney rose, towering over the girl in a way that felt deliberate. He forced a smile, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Hello," he began, voice dripping with false warmth. "Do you like stories?" The girl tilted her head but didn't answer. "Do you ever play pretend? Like when you pretend your toy is talking, or when you imagine something that didn't really happen?" The jury frowned. They saw what he was doing, trying to frame her as a child lost in fantasy. The girl blinked at him, confused, then hugged her rabbit. "Maybe," the attorney continued, "you thought you saw a man. But isn't it true that sometimes children see shadows and think they're monsters? Isn't that right?" The girl shook her head firmly, "No." The gallery gasped, a ripple of admiration for her small defiance. The attorney's smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "But you don't know what's real and what isn't, do you? You're only 3. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head and buried her face against her rabbit. The jury shifted uncomfortably, some glaring openly at the defense attorney. His attempt at discrediting her was backfiring. The judge finally intervened. "That's enough, counselor." His voice carried authority that brooked no challenge. "Step back." The defense attorney clenched his jaw, retreating reluctantly. He had wanted to dismantle her credibility, but all he had done was paint himself as a bully. The jury's sympathy for the child had deepened, and his client sat staring ahead, expressionless but with a twitch at the corner of his mouth that betrayed unease. The prosecutor decided to end the questioning there. She turned to the child, offering a soft smile. "Thank you, you've helped us very much." The girl nodded, then reached up to her guardian, who lifted her gently from the stand. The rabbit dangled from her hand, its ears trailing along the floor as she was carried away. The moment she disappeared through the side door, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Jurors whispered among themselves despite strict instructions not to. Reporters scribbled as though racing against time. Family members wept quietly, some from relief, others from the pain of hearing a child relive fragments of horror. The judge struck his gavel, demanding order, but even he couldn't erase the impact of what had just unfolded. For in those few minutes, with halting words and tiny gestures, a 3-year-old girl had shaken the foundations of the trial. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The next day, the courtroom filled even earlier than usual. By dawn, the steps outside were already crowded with reporters clutching cameras and microphones, their breath visible in the chilly morning air. Inside, the hum of anticipation was electric. People whispered about the child's testimony from the previous session, how she had pointed directly at the accused, how her tiny voice had carried words that even the best lawyers couldn't shake. Now the prosecution was preparing to introduce a new piece of evidence, something that had been kept quiet until this very moment. No one in the gallery knew exactly what was coming, but rumors swirled like wildfire. Some said it was a video, others guessed a surprise witness. Whatever it was, the defense looked unusually restless. The defendant sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles were white. He didn't look at anyone, not the jury, not his own attorney, not the family of the victims who sat behind the prosecutor's table. His jaw worked slowly, grinding against some unseen pressure. When the judge entered, the entire room rose to its feet. He surveyed the crowded chamber with a gaze that revealed both irritation and resignation. "This is a court of law, not a theater," he reminded them sharply, though even he knew his words did little to dampen the sense of drama that filled the air. The prosecutor rose with measured calm. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind a dozen times, knowing the risks. "Your Honor," she began, "with the court's permission, I would like to reintroduce an element from the original investigation for clarification purposes." The defense attorney stood immediately, his booming voice filling the room. "Objection. The prosecution is clearly planning a stunt. We have not been given proper notice of any new witnesses or exhibits." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Counselor, sit down. I'll hear the prosecution." The defense attorney sank into his chair reluctantly, muttering under his breath. The prosecutor continued, her tone even but her words carrying weight. "Your Honor, as this court knows, a canine unit was instrumental in the initial investigation of the crime scene. Today, with the court's permission, we have brought that same canine for presentation. The child witness recognized the animal during questioning in earlier sessions. We believe this may aid in clarifying her memory." The courtroom rippled with shock. A dog. Nobody had expected this. The judge hesitated, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was cautious about theatrics, but he also understood the potential value. Finally, he nodded. "Very well, proceed. But I want order maintained in this room." At his signal, the bailiff exited through a side door. The room fell utterly silent. Even the scratching of pens stopped. Every eye locked on the doorway, waiting. Then the sound of claws clicking against the polished floor echoed through the chamber. The German shepherd entered, led by its handler. The animal was large but calm, its coat sleek, its eyes sharp. It walked with disciplined precision, tail steady, head slightly lowered in obedience. For a moment it seemed like just a dog, another piece of evidence, another detail in a complex case. But then the child, seated again beside her guardian, froze. Her body stiffened, her eyes widened, and her hand, still gripping the stuffed rabbit, trembled. Slowly, almost unconsciously, she sat up, her gaze locked on the dog with an intensity no adult in the room could mistake. The transformation was immediate. Minutes earlier, she had been shy, hesitant, clinging to her guardian. Now she looked as though a floodgate of memory had burst open. Her chest rose and fell quickly, and for the first time during the trial, her voice broke the silence without being prompted. She whispered, "Dog." The single word carried like a gunshot. The handler froze mid-step. The jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, who gave a small nod, signaling to let the moment unfold. The girl's small hand rose shakily, pointing at the shepherd. Her lips quivered, but her voice, though soft, was clear enough for everyone to hear. "Dog to bad man." 2 words. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, as though the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Reporters froze, pens suspended in midair. Jurors gaped, their faces pale. The prosecutor's mouth parted slightly, stunned even though she had hoped for exactly this. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection! Objection, Your Honor, this is outrageous." He was shouting, red-faced, his booming voice trembling with panic. "The prosecution is coaching this child. A dog cannot be evidence of guilt. This is emotional manipulation of the jury." But his words sounded weak, hollow against the image of the little girl pointing at the dog, her innocent voice echoing in their minds. The judge struck his gavel hard. Order, order in the court. But even he couldn't hide the flicker of shock in his eyes. The prosecutor, regaining her composure, addressed the handler. "Is it true that the defendant was the officer assigned to this canine unit?" The handler straightened, his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. He was this dog's partner for 3 years." The connection snapped into place like a trap. The jury didn't need a long explanation. The child had linked the dog to the man, and in doing so, had tied the accused to the very crime scene he had tried to distance himself from. The defense attorney sputtered, waving his arms. "This is preposterous. A 3-year-old cannot provide credible testimony. Dogs cannot testify. This is a circus. But the jury wasn't listening to him anymore. Their eyes were on the little girl, whose hand still pointed at the dog, her expression etched with a mix of fear and certainty. The prosecutor wisely said nothing further. She knew the moment spoke for itself. Sometimes silence was the most powerful argument. The judge finally called for a recess, his gavel striking with more force than usual. "We will reconvene in 1 hour. Bailiff, clear the courtroom." Chaos erupted as soon as the judge left. Reporters rushed for the doors, their voices blending into a frantic storm of breaking news updates. Family members clutched each other, some weeping, some whispering prayers of thanks. The defense team huddled furiously, their voices sharp and tense. Through it all, the child sat quietly, her hand now resting on the rabbit once again. The storm around her seemed not to matter. She had said her truth, 2 simple words that would echo long after the trial ended. For the first time since the case began, the balance had shifted unmistakably. The turning point had arrived. The courtroom had seen drama before. It had heard confessions, witnessed outbursts, endured angry shouting matches between lawyers, and even stood silent during shocking verdicts. But never had it experienced what it had just witnessed. The voice of a 3-year-old child, trembling but unmistakable, pointing at a police dog and uttering 2 words that cut straight through the courtroom like a blade. "Bad man." The sound hung in the air long after her lips closed. It was as though the very walls of the chamber absorbed the words, amplifying their weight. The spectators didn't stir. Even the scratching of pens on notepads ceased. For one suspended moment, time itself seemed frozen. The jurors were the first to react. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between the child and the defendant. A middle-aged woman in the front row of the jury panel clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles whitening as she stared at the accused. Another juror, a man who had remained stoic throughout the trial, exhaled sharply, his composure cracking. They weren't hearing just the words of a child. They were hearing the echo of innocence, raw and unfiltered. The defendant sat rigid, his face pale, jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched under his skin. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table, the tendons in his arms straining visibly. For days he had maintained the mask of a calm, falsely assured man, the of someone who believed he was untouchable. Now that mask was slipping. His attorney, however, was not ready to surrender. He shot to his feet, his booming voice exploding into the stillness. "Objection! Objection, Your Honor!" He jabbed a finger toward the girl, then toward the prosecutor. "This is not testimony, it's manipulation. She's a toddler barely out of diapers, repeating words she's been coached to say. This," he paused, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured wildly toward the dog. "This is theater, nothing more." The judge pounded his gavel. Bang, bang, bang. "Order in the court, sit down, counselor." But the damage was done. The jury wasn't looking at him. They weren't listening to his protests. Their eyes were fixed on the little girl still pointing at the dog, her innocent face filled with the kind of certainty no adult could fake. She wasn't trying to persuade. She wasn't trying to win. She was simply telling the truth as she remembered it. The prosecutor, recognizing the gravity of the moment, rose slowly. She didn't need to dramatize or embellish. The child had already delivered the most devastating testimony of the trial. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "the record will reflect the witness's words. Nothing more needs to be asked." The judge nodded, though his expression betrayed unease. He had been on the bench long enough to know the legal weight of testimony this young was fragile, easily challenged. Yet as he glanced at the jury, he saw what every lawyer in the room already understood. The words were burned into their minds. No objection, no legal technicality could erase them. The defense attorney, realizing the uphill battle before him, tried again. He approached the stand carefully, softening his voice. "Sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile, "do you know what a bad man is? Sometimes we call people bad when they don't share toys or when they're mean on the playground. Isn't that right?" The little girl tilted her head, confused for a moment, then shook it firmly. Her ponytail swayed with emotion. "Bad man," she repeated, louder this time. Her finger, still trembling, lifted once more, not toward the dog but toward the defendant himself. A collective gasp surged through the courtroom. The defense attorney froze, his face draining of color. His attempt to soften her words had only backfired, sharpening their edge. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already forming. Child points at defendant, calls him bad man. The prosecutor stayed silent. She didn't need to say anything. Sometimes the most powerful argument was to step back and let the truth stand naked in the room. The defendant finally moved. For the first time in the trial, he shifted violently in his chair, leaning toward his attorney with urgent whispers. His composure was gone, his face twisted with anger and panic. The image of control he had built over weeks was crumbling under the gaze of a child. The judge, sensing the volatility of the moment, ordered a recess. His gavel slammed against the block, the sharp crack echoing like thunder. "Court will stand in recess for 30 minutes. Bailiff, clear the room." But 30 minutes did nothing to erase what had happened. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Reporters jostled for space, shouting updates into cameras, their voices rising above the din. Breaking news: inside the courtroom today, a 3-year-old witness pointed directly at the defendant and called him a bad man. Microphones captured the words, broadcast them, repeated them until they were stamped into the nation's consciousness. Inside, the defense huddled in a corner room, their voices sharp and desperate. "We have to move to strike her testimony," one lawyer insisted. "We'll claim emotional manipulation, argue she doesn't understand." But even as they said it, they knew the truth. No legal motion could erase the image from the jury's minds. The prosecution gathered quietly in their own chamber, subdued but confident. They hadn't expected the child to point again, to make the connection so direct. It was a gift, one they didn't need to embellish. All they had to do now was let the memory fester in the jury's hearts. And the jury, they couldn't stop replaying it. Over and over in their minds, they saw the child's trembling finger, heard her small voice, and felt the weight of her certainty. It wasn't sophisticated testimony, but it didn't need to be. It was pure, unvarnished, and devastatingly human. When court resumed, the judge tried to restore order, his gavel striking repeatedly. But the energy in the room had changed. The scales of justice had tilted, and everyone knew it. The defense attorney tried to recover, launching into arguments about child psychology, about memory formation, about the unreliability of children under stress. He spoke for nearly 40 minutes, citing studies, waving papers, trying to paint the testimony as nothing but childish fantasy. But every time he said unreliable, the jurors remembered the little girl's eyes. Every time he said fantasy, they remembered her trembling hand. And every time he said manipulated, they remembered the way she had spoken with raw conviction. The prosecutor stood only briefly after his tirade. "Ladies and," she said softly, turning toward the jury, "you heard her, you saw her, and you know that in her innocence she spoke the truth. That is all." The simplicity of her words only reinforced the child's testimony. The day ended with the judge adjourning early, perhaps sensing that no further evidence, no witness, no legal argument could match the impact of those 2 words. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the echo of the girl's voice lingered. "Bad man." It was more than testimony. It was a verdict spoken long before the jury would deliberate. And deep inside, everyone, judge, prosecutor, defense, jury, and even the accused himself, knew it. The case had turned. The courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like the epicenter of an earthquake. The tremor had already hit. The child's 2 words had cracked open the foundation of the trial, and now the aftershocks were rippling through everyone present. The judge banged his gavel again and again, but order was impossible. Voices clashed in the gallery, reporters whispering furiously into their phones, spectators murmuring and family members gasping or weeping openly. The air was thick with tension, the kind that prickled against the skin like static before a lightning strike. At the defense table, the accused sat slumped, his eyes darting between the jury and the child as if searching for an escape route. His attorney leaned close, whispering with forced calm, but the panic on his face betrayed him. The once cocky swagger that had carried them through weeks of testimony had vanished. Across the aisle, the prosecution kept their composure. The lead prosecutor remained seated, hands folded neatly on the table, her eyes sharp. She knew better than to fan the flames. The child's words needed no embellishment. The silence they had left in their wake was a weapon sharper than any cross-examination. The bailiff finally managed to quiet the room. The judge leaned forward, his expression grim. This court will not tolerate disruptions. This is a trial, not a circus. His gavel cracked once more, but his voice lacked its usual iron. He had seen too many jurors lean forward, too many pairs of eyes fixate on the accused with renewed suspicion. He knew the trial had shifted, perhaps irrevocably. The defense attorney rose, his booming voice filling the chamber. "Your Honor, the defense moves to strike the child's words from the record. She is 3 years old. 3. She cannot understand the gravity of this proceeding. She cannot differentiate between truth and fantasy. These words should not carry weight in a court of law." His words were strong, but his tone betrayed desperation. The prosecutor stood, calm and deliberate. "Your Honor, the defense is correct in one thing. The witness is a child, but it is precisely her innocence that gives her words weight. She has no agenda, no motive, no concept of strategy. What she said was not rehearsed, not planted, but spoken from memory. The jury has the right to hear it." The judge sighed, pressing a hand to his temple. He knew this debate would ignite controversy no matter how he ruled. Finally, he spoke. "The child's statement will remain on the record. The jury will weigh its credibility as they see fit. That is all." The defense attorney slammed his papers onto the table, defeated. But the moment was not over. The prosecutor rose again, this time addressing the court with care. "Your Honor, at this time, I request permission to call the canine handler to the stand." The defense groaned audibly. "More theatrics. Must we really parade a dog and its handler before the jury like this is a school demonstration?" But the judge, perhaps sensing the importance of clarification, allowed it. "Proceed." The handler, a middle-aged officer with steady eyes and a calm demeanor, stepped to the stand. He swore the oath and sat tall, his uniform crisp, his posture unshakable. "Officer," the prosecutor began, "how long have you worked with the canine unit?" 17 years, ma'am," he replied. "And the dog we saw today, Rex, who was his primary partner before being reassigned?" The handler's voice was steady. "The defendant. For 3 years they were inseparable. Every mission, every investigation. A bond like that is unbreakable." The words struck hard. The jury shifted again, their eyes narrowing on the accused. The prosecutor continued, her tone calm but deliberate. "So, officer, when the child pointed at Rex and associated him with the phrase, 'bad man,' is it reasonable to believe she remembered the man who worked with the dog?" The handler nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. Children remember dogs. They remember who walks with them, who commands them. That memory would stick, especially in a traumatic event." The defense attorney shot up. "Objection, speculation." The judge frowned. "Sustained. Officer, confine your answers to what you observed." But the damage was already done. The jury didn't need expert analysis. They had already drawn the line themselves, from dog to handler, from handler to accused. The prosecutor stepped back, satisfied. No further questions. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Officer, isn't it true that dogs are handled by multiple officers at times?" "Yes, sir." "And isn't it true that a child, especially one of 3 years, could confuse who was handling the animal at any given moment. That's possible. Possible or likely. The officer stared back, unflinching. Possible, not likely. The defense attorney growled under his breath. He was losing ground, and he knew it. When the handler was dismissed, the courtroom buzzed again. The jurors whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. The child's testimony had planted the seed, and the handler's words had watered it. During a recess later that afternoon, reporters flooded the courthouse steps. Microphones shoved into faces, cameras flashing, headlines screamed across the nation. Toddler links defendant to police dog. Courtroom gasps. News anchors dissected the phrase "bad man" with endless commentary, while legal analysts debated its admissibility. But inside the courtroom, where the real battle unfolded, the atmosphere had shifted permanently. The defense was on its heels, scrambling to salvage credibility. The prosecution had the wind at their backs, though they remained careful, knowing overconfidence could be fatal. And the jury, ordinary men and women chosen to weigh the fate of another human being, sat with heavy silence. They had heard lies, spin, and polished arguments for weeks, but nothing struck them like the voice of a child. It was the kind of truth that bypassed logic and went straight to the soul. As the day drew to a close, the judge adjourned early, perhaps sensing the emotional weight was too much for all involved. The gavel's final crack echoed as people rose, gathering their belongings in hushed silence. The little girl was led out gently by her guardian, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her words still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. 2 words, small and simple, had turned the trial upside down. And by nightfall, the nation itself was divided between those who doubted and those who believed. Inside the courthouse, however, one truth was undeniable. The defense no longer controlled the story. The child did. The final days of the trial arrived with the kind of tension that could be felt before anyone even entered the courtroom. Outside, the courthouse steps looked like a media carnival. Satellite vans lined the streets, reporters shouted live updates into cameras, and curious citizens crowded behind barricades just for the chance to say they had been there. Inside, however, the air was thick, solemn, and electric. Everyone knew the end was near. The judge entered with his usual gravitas, but even he could not hide the fatigue around his eyes. Weeks of testimony had weighed heavily on him, but nothing compared to the haunting echo of 2 simple words that had shifted the entire trial's momentum. The jury filed in, their faces drawn and serious. Some avoided the defendant's gaze entirely. Others looked straight at him, as though measuring him against the voice of a 3-year-old child. The prosecutor stood first for closing arguments. She moved slowly to the center of the courtroom, carrying only a single piece of paper, though she hardly looked at it. Her voice was calm, deliberate, but it carried a quiet power that demanded attention. "Ladies and of the jury," she began, "you have listened patiently for weeks. You have heard experts, witnesses, and arguments from both sides. But at the heart of this case lies something that no expert, no lawyer, no strategy can fabricate: the truth spoken by a child." She paused, letting the silence work for her. The jurors leaned forward instinctively. She did not give us paragraphs. She did not rehearse speeches. She gave us 2 words, words spoken without agenda, without manipulation, words born of memory and innocence. "Bad man." The phrase hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed the entire room had stopped breathing. She remembered the dog. She remembered the man who commanded it. She remembered enough to connect what she saw with what she felt in her little heart, that the man sitting before you is guilty. Guilty of the crimes he is accused of, guilty of shattering lives, guilty of betraying the oath he once swore as an officer of the law. Her voice strengthened as she spoke, but she kept her tone grounded. "The defense will tell you she is too young, that she cannot know right from wrong. But ladies and sometimes the very youngest among us see the clearest. because they have not learned how to lie. They have not learned how to bend the truth to their advantage. They speak what they remember, what they feel, what they know. She took a step closer to the jury, lowering her voice. You are not asked to trust the words of a child blindly. You are asked to weigh them alongside everything else you've seen and heard. And when you do, when you connect the threads, you will see that her words do not stand alone. They align with the evidence. They align with the timeline. They align with the truth. Her gaze swept across the jury box, her final words steady and sharp. Justice is not complicated. Sometimes it's as simple as two words. We ask you to deliver the justice that this little girl and this community deserve. She returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. The defense attorney rose immediately, his steps quick, his face taut with urgency. He knew the prosecution's argument had pierced deeply, and he had little time to patch the wound. Ladies and, he began, his voice booming, let us not be swayed by emotion. This is a court of law, not a stage for sentiment. Yes, a child spoke. Yes, her words tugged at your hearts, but justice must be built on evidence, not feelings, on facts, not impressions. He paced before the jury, papers clenched tightly in his hand. The prosecution wants you to see this case through the eyes of a child, but children misremember. Children imagine. Children repeat things they've heard. They are easily influenced. Is it possible, just possible, that she was guided to say what she said, that her guardian, the prosecutors, even the media coverage she overheard, could have shaped those words? He stopped, locking eyes with each juror in turn. Would you send a man to prison, potentially for life, based on the testimony of a 3-year-old child? Would you put the weight of justice on shoulders so small? His words had force, but there was something hollow beneath them. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, but their expressions betrayed doubt, not conviction. The defense attorney pressed on. Look at the evidence, he thundered. Where are the fingerprints? Where is the DNA? Where is the concrete proof? The prosecution has relied on emotion because their case is weak. But you must not convict on sympathy. That is not justice. That is vengeance disguised as law. He softened his voice, leaning closer to the jury. If you have any doubt, and I know you do, then your duty is clear. You must acquit. He returned to his seat with a flourish, but his shoulders sagged. He knew his words had not landed as powerfully as the prosecutor. The judge gave his final instructions, reminding the jury of their sacred duty, to deliberate carefully, to weigh all evidence, to set aside bias and emotion. But even he could feel the weight of the two words that lingered in the air, words no instruction could erase. The jury filed out, the heavy door closing behind them. The room exhaled collectively, the tension shifting into restless anticipation. Families held hands. Reporters whispered furiously into their devices. The defendant sat rigid, staring at the table before him. Hours passed. The courthouse hummed with speculation, each minute stretching like an eternity. Then, at last, the bailiff opened the door. The jury filed back in, their faces grave and unreadable. The defendant swallowed hard. His attorney gripped his arm, whispering frantically. Across the aisle, the prosecutor clasped her hands together, her eyes never leaving the foreperson. The judge cleared his throat. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict? The woman in the front row rose, holding the folded slip of paper in trembling hands. We have, Your Honor. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. He unfolded it slowly, his expression carefully neutral as he read. Then he returned it and nodded. Madam Foreperson, please read the verdict aloud. The woman's voice shook at first, then steadied. In the matter of the state versus the defendant, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Gasps erupted through the courtroom. The child's guardian clutched her tightly, tears streaming down her face. Reporters scrambled for their devices, their voices rising in a chorus of breaking news alerts. The prosecutor closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a long, steady breath. At the defense table, the accused slumped, his face a mask of shock and fury. His attorney's hand still gripped his arm, but it was useless now. The battle was lost. The judge struck his gavel sharply, calling for order. The court thanks the jury for its service. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. But the formalities were drowned by the wave of reaction. The child, too young to understand the full magnitude of what had just happened, clutched her rabbit and whispered to her guardian, "Is it done?" Her guardian kissed the top of her head. "Yes, sweetheart, it's done." 2 words had shaped the path to justice. 2 words had toppled a defense built on weeks of arguments. 2 words had carried the weight of truth across a courtroom filled with doubt. And in the end, 2 words had decided a man's fate. The courtroom was slow to empty after the verdict, as if no one quite believed it was over. The gavel had fallen, the jury had spoken, yet the echo of those words, "guilty," still clung to the air like smoke. The defendant was led away in shackles, his once proud posture reduced to a stoop. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look at the jury, the prosecutor, or the child who had undone him with nothing more than the truth. Reporters rushed to the exits, phones pressed to their ears, voices overlapping in a frenzy. Headlines were already forming. Toddler's testimony sways jury. 2 words deliver justice. The child who changed a trial. Cameras flashed, their bursts of light chasing after attorneys as they left the chamber, some defiant, some exhausted. In the quiet corner of the gallery, the child sat in her guardian's lap, hugging her rabbit close. She didn't fully understand the storm she had unleashed, nor the way her words had rippled beyond the walls of the courthouse. For her, the trial had been a blur of strange faces, heavy silences, and moments of fear. What she understood in her small and simple way was that the bad man would not hurt anyone anymore. Her guardian kissed her temple and whispered, "You were so brave, sweetheart, so very brave." The little girl only nodded, already half asleep against the comforting rhythm of a heartbeat she trusted. Across the aisle, the family of the victim held each other tightly. Tears streamed freely, some born of grief that would never fade, some of relief that justice, at long last, had been delivered. One mother looked toward the child and mouthed a silent "thank you," though the girl never saw it. The prosecutor, leaving the courtroom with her files clutched to her chest, paused in the hallway where cameras and microphones crowded around her. "No comment," she said firmly, her voice tired. She wasn't interested in theatrics or victory laps. The case had never been about her career. It had been about a truth so small and fragile that it nearly slipped through the cracks of the system. The defense attorney tried to speak to the press as well, but his words fell flat. "This verdict was built on emotion, not evidence," he insisted. "We will appeal. We cannot allow precedent to be set by the unreliable words of a toddler." His voice carried indignation, but his eyes betrayed defeat. He knew an appeal would face an uphill battle. The power of the jury's decision lay not only in law but in the court of public opinion, which had already crowned the child as the trial's central truth-teller. By evening, the story dominated every news outlet. Cable channels replayed the moment endlessly, the little girl pointing, her voice small but steady. Commentators debated its meaning. Was it justice, or was it dangerous to let innocence shape verdicts? Psychologists weighed in on child memory. Former judges discussed precedent, but no amount of analysis could erase the image itself. It had become iconic, a moment frozen in collective memory. In living rooms across the country, families watched in silence. Some wept, imagining their own children in that chair, pointing with such fragile courage. Others argued about fairness, about whether justice had been decided by evidence or by emotion. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing: they would never forget the sound of her voice. For the jurors, the days that followed were heavy. They had carried a burden unlike any other, asked to decide the fate of a man while the world watched. Many admitted later that it was the child's testimony that tipped the scales, not because it provided evidence in the strictest sense, but because it cut through the noise. "She reminded us what was real," one juror confided in a rare interview. Everything else was arguments and technicalities. She was truth. The judge, too, carried the moment with him. He had seen many trials end, but this one lingered. In chambers, long after the cameras had gone, he sat alone with his thoughts. He wondered about the balance between law and humanity, about whether he had presided over justice or over something messier, harder to define. Yet when he remembered the child's steady finger and those two words, he found himself unable to doubt. Sometimes the law bent toward simplicity, toward a truth that no statute could capture. Weeks later, when sentencing was delivered, the courtroom was quieter. The frenzy had cooled, but the presence of the child's words still lingered in every seat. The defendant received a heavy sentence, his fate sealed by more than just evidence, by the weight of innocence itself. He did not speak in his own defense. He stared at the floor, his silence louder than any plea. Afterward, the prosecutor declined further interviews. The defense filed their appeal, but few believed it would succeed. The case had become larger than itself, a story the nation had already written in its collective memory. For the child, life slowly returned to a fragile normalcy. She went back to playing with dolls, learning letters, and drawing pictures with crayons. She didn't remember the courtroom in detail, nor the sea of faces staring at her. What stayed with her, faint and childlike, was the relief of knowing the bad man was gone. Her guardian shielded her from the news coverage, from the debates and headlines. They wanted her to grow without the weight of a trial resting on her small shoulders. But in quiet moments, her guardian would watch her sleep and marvel at the strength hidden in such innocence. 2 words had changed everything. The case itself entered textbooks and law journals, debated for years by scholars who questioned whether a 3-year-old's testimony could, or should, carry such influence. Yet beyond the legal community, the public clung to the story as something greater than law. It became a symbol of how truth sometimes emerges from the most unexpected voices. In the end, justice had not come from the polished speeches of attorneys, nor from the forensic experts, nor from the long lines of evidence charts. It had come from the smallest person in the room, armed with nothing more than memory and courage. And so, the trial was remembered not by the name of the defendant or the long hours of legal sparring, but by the image of a child pointing at a dog and saying 2 words that would never be forgotten. Bad man. The courtroom had been stunned in that moment, and in many ways the world remained stunned still. Because sometimes justice is not complex, sometimes it is simple, sometimes it is spoken with the clarity only innocence can give. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes only 2 words to change everything.